We're Annual Reviews, a nonprofit publisher of invited scholarly review articles written by expert authors that synthesize and integrate knowledge for the progress of science and the benefit of society. But nearly all our articles are behind a paywall, so only those with institutional or personal subscriptions can read them. We thought this needed to change. The challenge is that our reviews are different from primary research articles because they're invited by editorial committees and there are no funder mandates or funding for them to be open. Put simply, the article processing charge model doesn't work for our reviews, so we've developed a new approach to open access or OA. It's called Subscribe to Open, or S2O for short. Immediate, diamond, open access, inclusive for readers and authors in all disciplines and countries with no APC. It meets institutional procurement policies and is endorsed by OA 2020 and Plan S. Here's how S2O works. Institutions participate by subscribing as before, but once the journal subscription target is achieved, the articles in the current volume are open to everyone. We want to use S2O to convert our journals to OA, and are asking you to work with us to achieve this goal. S2O maximizes the usefulness of institutional subscription budgets by securing access for the library's patrons and making expert knowledge broadly available. What's more, subscribing institutions get additional benefits, such as access to review articles ahead of the publication date, permanent rights to the current year's content, and additional years of back volumes. What happens if the subscription target isn't met? Access will be limited to the paid subscribers and their patrons. We're asking institutional subscribers to support annual reviews as we convert our highly cited journals to open access. Renew or become a new subscriber today.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this event on scientific knowledge for everyone. My name is Richard Gallagher and I am the President and Editor-in-Chief of Annual Reviews. I suspect that all of us, or at least the vast majority, believe that scientific knowledge can and must be openly shared, and it's incredibly uplifting to see so many people from all around the world gathering here to explore this compelling objective. This event is part of Open Access Week, an online festival that promotes barrier-free access to knowledge. As you will have seen from the video, and by the way, that was the world premiere of that video, Annual Reviews is embracing open access. My first thought for our contribution to Open Access Week was to bang the drum for the value of Annual Reviews, which is indeed considerable. And for our open access model called Subscribe to Open, which is really fair and equitable. But there will be other times for that. And instead today, we're focusing on how to make scientific knowledge available to everyone. Open access to the research literature is essential for this to happen, but it's not sufficient. We also need to present the real world value to individuals in an engaging fashion. Let me give you an example. Annual Reviews, one of our journals, recently published a stellar review on intimate relationships and depression. Perhaps there's someone in our lives that would benefit from information on this topic. If it was open access, we could send that person a link, and here's what they would read in the summary. This article provides a critical review of existing research on intimate, marriage or marriage-like relationship distress and risk for depression. So far so good. It then continues, using the meta framework of research triangulation, we seek to synthesize research evidence across several different methodologies and study designs, and to draw the most reliable conclusion regarding a potential causal association between relationship distress and depression. That's great for the research community, but it's not quite the way to convey this potentially useful knowledge, this useful material to someone who's depressed. So open access, I think, is the start of the process to making knowledge widely available, but it's not the whole process. Today, we'll hear about all aspects of communication of science and how best to do it, and on the ups and downs of being involved in it. It's not all sunshine and lollipops. I've invited 3 people that I have huge admiration for as communicators of science. They'll engage in 3 one-on-one conversations, each lasting about 10 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A and a general discussion. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, or you'd like me to ask on your behalf, please type them into the question box. And please do interact throughout the event using the chat. It can be a really good partner for the discussion. Let me introduce our 3 experts. Firstly, Harmit Malik is Professor at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle in the United States. Harmit is a virologist. He's interested in the evolution of our body's interaction with viruses, interactions with contemporary scourges like HIV, as well as ancient viruses whose fossils litter our genome. And he studies the interface between human cells and viruses that make us sick at the level of proteins and gene variants that could influence susceptibility to infection. Harmit grew up in the city of Bombay, now Mumbai in India. He received his degree in chemical engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology and a PhD in biology at the University of Rochester in New York before he moved to Seattle in 2003. So welcome, Harmit. Diána Ürge-Vorsatz is a professor at the Central University in Budapest, Hungary. Diána is a prominent researcher on climate change and sustainable energy policy. She serves as vice chair of the Working Group on Mitigation for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the United Nations body responsible for advancing knowledge on human-induced climate change. Her group assesses methods for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and removing them from the atmosphere. And Diána's personal research is conversion to climate neutrality of the building sector, which currently accounts for almost 40% of process-related greenhouse gas emissions. So welcome, Diána. Rosie Mestel is my colleague. She is executive editor of Knowable magazine, and she's based in Los Angeles in the United States. Rosie gained a PhD in yeast genetics at the University of California, Davis, before switching careers and earning a certificate in science communication. She then served as the West Coast correspondent for New Scientist magazine before joining the Los Angeles Times as a reporter and then as editor of Science and Health. Before she joined Knowable, Rosie was chief magazine editor at Nature, where she ran a team of 60 people in the production of news, features, and commentaries. So welcome, Rosie. To all 3 of you, thank you very much for participating in this event. The 3 conversations will, in the first one, Diána will interview Harmit, then Harmit will interview Rosie, and Rosie will finally interview Diána. So Diána and Harmit, please take the virtual stage. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for this fantastic invitation. I'm so excited that so many people are genuinely interested in open access knowledge, despite that we are all really fed up with Zoomed knowledge dumping on us. Anyway, apologies if my voice has issues because I have a cold. So Harmit, it's really great to talk to you. You're very much in the front line, both in terms of research and also in terms of outreach. Many of our listeners and viewers today, I'm sure, are your followers on Twitter and other social media. Do you feel that there is a personal toll?
Thank you very much, Diána, for the question. I also want to thank Richard for the invitation here. It's a really interesting question in terms of engagement on social media while practicing as a, active scientist. I think there is a possibility of a personal toll, especially if one sphere of influence directly encroaches onto the other, but I also see it as a very important responsibility to be able to communicate science in a sort of unfettered way, where you can actually directly interact with the scientist who's actually making the discoveries. I think social media does provide an incredible opportunity for you to engage directly with the scientists, and I take that responsibility very seriously. The personal toll question is a really excellent one, partly because we are all trying to keep our labs active and operational. The last 18 months have been really exciting, but also extremely exhausting, because we're also dealing with all of the pressures of keeping our labs running while we're also dealing with all the constraints of running a lab in the midst of a COVID pandemic. So I think it's really important that there be balance, like with most things. But it's true that for many of my colleagues, this has been perhaps the most exhausting time of their academic careers. And it's really important for us to try to mitigate these costs as much as possible.
I guess, Harmit, you're especially, and your community especially under pressure, since your topic was really in the limelight in the last 2 years. So you mentioned social media, and we did say that you are very popular on social media. Do you think that, what do you think is the most important for a scientist to on social media, interacting with your research community, or is it more influencing the general discussion, the general discourse, or perhaps learning? What is your preference, and what do you think is right for scientists?
Excellent question again, Diana. So I actually started engaging in social media completely for selfish reasons. I wanted to engage with my peer community, in ways that was not really possible before. I could actually send a question out, ask about a reagent, and within minutes get an answer from any part of the world. And in fact, I've engaged in many collaborations that would have not been possible without social media. I think a lot of that changed with the pandemic, partly because every single paper, every single observation was in the front headlines of newspapers around the world, and that's not necessarily the way science operates. There's a lot of chiseling away and refining and more nuanced observations and conversations that social media sort of tends to remove all of the nuance from a conversation. So if there are any caveats with a particular discovery, those caveats are never discussed because of the constraints on social media. The other very interesting observation that I've made over the last 20 months is that while I go in thinking that everybody's engaging in good faith, that's not normally the case. Everybody, if you assume that everybody's making this discussion in good faith, you run the risk of actually just falling victim to people who really don't have an agenda in a good scientific discussion, but they instead have their own political biases that they'd like to just introduce into every conversation. And as scientists, we try to keep those biases out of our conversations, mostly because we want that to not color our conversations. But it's actually impossible to have a conversation about COVID origins or about vaccination strategies without there being a significant influence from political strategists who really don't actually have a scientific background but are very interested in making their point of view known. And so this has been a very educational 18 months for me in terms of what social media is absolutely capable of and what we should be wary of as well.
Right, Harmit, and I suppose this itself would be a topic for its own dedicated hour. So I guess we won't get into that. How you manage to shield yourself from those conversations that you didn't necessarily feel as productive. But let's go more back towards publishing. And in academia, it's we have to publish, and we are measured by publications. But if we think about it, in any other areas of our lives, we are getting kind of rankings of the different products, of different services based on their fairness, based on their environmental friendliness, based on some metric of goodness for society. But there is nothing similar really in publishing. So for example, why there is fair trade coffee, why there are organic products, and so on, there is really very little similar among the journals. And excuse me. So do you think that it would be important that we also kind of rank or at least classify journals, scientific journals, where it's more ethical? We consider more ethical to publish than in others. And in this, I mean, for example, open access. The topic of discussion of this whole hour is open access. But beyond open access, also inclusiveness and transparency and in general, more responsible publishing. Do you think it would make sense that we researchers really consider these kinds of criteria when we choose a journal where we submit our most prominent pieces of research?
Diana, that's an excellent question, something that I feel very passionate about. I absolutely think that you do make ethical choices all the time when you're choosing publication venues. I also recognize that because of the way we evaluate scientists by sort of various metrics that are sort of imposed about publication venues and citation indices, there is a lot of pressure, especially on a young scientist, in order to sort of publish in the most visible venue possible. But actually, the caveat is that the most visible venue possible should be one that is completely open to any researcher anywhere in the world. So I think aiming to publish all of your work, but especially your best work in open access journals, is really the only ethical choice that we have here. I think the preset is that we've grown up in a society, at least I grew up in a society, where most of the prominent journals were not open access. In fact, open access is still, relatively speaking, a young movement. And they basically really fostered this view that it's really not possible for you to simultaneously have an open access model that is actually capable of communicating the best science and yet be financially feasible. The last 20 years have shown that is no longer a good argument. And there is really no good argument beyond just saving the profit margins of some of these giant publishing houses to not go open access. And I hope that most of my colleagues will continue to do that. Now, there's been a halfway step made by a lot of journals where a lot of the COVID-19 research is made completely available and open access. But nobody really knows what's going to happen to these articles after the pandemic is considered to be over. And rather than that, why not publish in a venue where it's going to be available, for the rest of their term or the rest of their useful life as a publication? So I absolutely think, both in terms of equity, making your articles available all across the world, including in parts of the world that are really reeling badly because of the pandemic, you really owe it to society, I would argue, to make your articles, the products that of scientific grants that you've achieved, as open as possible, so that they actually have the maximum impact.
Absolutely, Harmit. Thank you very much. I fully agree with you. Harmit, you, as you mentioned, and as Richard mentioned as well, you grew up in a non-English speaking country, which primarily doesn't, where English is not the first language. So do you think that this very large emphasis on English language in scientific publishing does it introduce a bias? Do you think it excludes some of the word or most of the word from the scientific debate?
I think in a large part, it does introduce a bias. Moreover, we tend to often hear comments. I've certainly seen comments as a reviewer where another reviewer has made a comment that this article does not seem to be written by an English-speaking author, where sort of biases creep in, where we sort of do not distinguish between the quality of the science and perhaps the quality of the grammar in which the paper is written. And that also creates its own sense of bias. I do think, though, that the level of investment into English as the primary scientific language of communication is so significant and entrenched that we will not necessarily be able to change that. Rather, I think that lay science-friendly venues such as Knowable and other venues that are able to transmit that information in a more communicable form to lay scientists, they actually have a very important role to make sure that the science is accurately represented and accurately translated in multiple languages, such that, again, editorial biases do not actually creep in at the level of translation. I do think that there is actually a very significant bias in terms of English being the primary language of communication. But I also worry that I don't think we have the ability to completely reverse that right now. So the best we can do is to make sure that the general public, when they access the fruits of these articles, they're able to do so in a completely transparent manner.
Thank you, Harmit. That was so exciting, and I will have tons of questions more to ask you, but I'm afraid our time is up. But maybe if we get some more time towards the end, then I will come back to the remaining questions. Thank you, Harmit.
Thank you, Diana. That was a pleasure. Should I move on to my questions for Rosie?
Yeah,
welcome,
do,
Rosie. It's exciting to have you here. I would actually be very interested in asking you the first question, which is, could you talk a little bit about your career path from a scientist to a science writer to now the executive editor at Knowable, where you sort of are also marshaling a lot of other resources at your disposal?
Sure. Okay, so first of all, the video is a bit delayed, so it's a bit discombobulating, but the sound is okay, I hope. So going back even further, I never intended to go into science. I wanted to do ceramics, but at the age of 16, I was told very cruelly that I had to take one science at what they call O-levels then in England. So I took it. I took biology, and I was totally jazzed by genetics. I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. So I quickly sort of switched, got my chemistry and my physics that I needed to get, and went off and did an undergraduate degree in genetics. Loved it. Then went off to do a PhD in California. I cannot say that I loved working in a lab, and I cannot say that I was any good at it, actually. I seem to remember, bringing gels up to my supervisor, and the agarose hadn't been poured properly, and the sort of look of horror on his face. So I did finish that PhD, and then I went up and did a postdoc in an area that I found really, really interesting. But even there, I wasn't into working in a lab day to day. And at the same time, I would read Science and Nature and see that there were these people who wrote about science at the front end of the book, the front half, as Nature calls it. And I thought, I'd love to do that. But I can't, I thought. I don't know why I thought I couldn't, but eventually I did figure out how to get to the science communication program at UC Santa Cruz. And I have to say, when I was clearing out my stuff in the freezer before I left that postdoc lab, I found so many little Eppendorf tubes which had just written on them fragment. It was a piece of DNA, and at the time I knew what it was. So I think it's sort of very lucky for research that I left research and went into science journalism. And right around that time that I finished the Santa Cruz program, I got a job at Discover for a year, and then worked as a West Coast correspondent for New Scientist, writing about all kinds of stuff. And then to the LA Times, and then to Nature for 3.5 years. And then just as I was coming back to LA, Knowable was ramping up, and I was approached by the editor-in-chief of Knowable, Eva Emerson, who asked me whether I'd like to join the team, and I did, and it has been the greatest fun building Knowable from the ground up. Super fun.
Well, I don't know about science, but certainly it has been a boon for science writing and editing that you decided to take that left turn. I wanted to ask you, you've had a lot of time to think about the role that high-quality, lay-friendly science open access articles that are published in Knowable play in educating the general public, especially in terms of anticipating concerns and disseminating good scientific concepts. So what is the role that venues such as Knowable can play, not just in the US, but also in a larger context around the world?
Well, Richard stole one of my little tricks. I'm in Vegas, so I have some props here because this is a show, right? And so I had a passage that I was going to read from. let's see, the majority of primary IgH translocations, F11Q13, cyclin D1, 6P21, cyclin D3, 4P16, FG, FR3, and MMSET. And so this is from an article about chromosomal translocations in multiple myeloma. And I had a personal reason due to a friend's condition to do some research on that. And luckily I was trained in genetics, but if I had not been, and I was somebody who for personal reasons was trying to find out about multiple myeloma, good luck with that. Let's see, people need access to knowledge. They need access to knowledge for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one of the ones that perhaps we forget is just people are curious. They're interested in all kinds of stuff. And some of the hits, I suppose, that I've noticed, so they're not necessarily ones you would expect. Sure, yes. I mean, one of, I think, Knowable's all-time favorite articles is one on chronic sinusitis. But another one was on what makes a tree a tree. That's not sort of news you can use, but people are really interested in it. They are interested in stuff because they're useful personally. They're interested in stuff, and they should understand scientific concepts for societal reasons, be it about COVID or I don't know, all kinds of things, climate change. So I would say it's really, really important to get information out to the general public, and there are many tiers of access, if you like, that go beyond making journals open access that make that possible. And I would also say that just in my own life, going back to my props, I mean, I thought to myself, just in the last week, how many times have I gone, or what are some examples of papers that I went out and searched for on the web to try and learn about this, that, or the other. So there was the one on chromosome translocations in multiple myeloma, effects of intermittent fasting on the lipid profile. That was another one that I was interested in for personal reasons. What contribution did Theodore Bovary play in understanding why some weird critters lose their chromosomes at early times in development? That was one for an article. How are moth wings acoustic metamaterials? That was another one for an article. What does drought do to chloroplast turnover? That was for an article. I could go on, something about prediabetes, something about whether the diabetes prevention program actually works when it's implemented more broadly than in sort of the ideal clinical settings. Yeah, I mean, there's like constant moments.
So even as you described it, there's like this giant ocean of publications that keeps getting added to, and Noble can only make a very small dent to that. So what would be your recommendations for what should be mandatory requirements for articles published in terms of lay-friendly summaries that should accompany this in order to make them accessible to the general public? Because as you said, so many of them are tied up in jargon that a non-scientist would not be able to really comprehend what is being said here.
Well, there should be lay summaries, and ideally those lay summaries would be written by skilled science communicators in concert with the scientist, I would say, to make them truly lay. I mean, scientists are great at science. Some of them are fantastic communicators to the lay audience. Other people aren't as fantastic communicators. There's sort of tricks and no-nos to do with jargon terms, et cetera, et cetera. And there's many other tiers of access, I would say, that are needed in society. With regards to the single study lay summaries, it's important to give people the broader context of those. But I don't even think that that's enough, because you need, say you've got a study that shows that if you eat a kilo of broccoli a week, you will reduce your lipid profile by so much. I mean, is that clinically relevant? How does it sit with all the other things you can do to lower your lipid profile? For all we know, eating less cabbage each week would give you a better lowering of your lipid profile. How does that sit with the broad set of studies that have been done over the years on the effect of broccoli and lipid profiles? I mean, maybe this study is an outlier. So what I'm saying is you need broader articles that really put things in context. And then, of course, there's societal issues, like maybe that broccoli study was paid for by the Broccoli Board of America. Are there conflict of interest issues here? I mean, that's kind of a silly example, but I think you know what I'm getting at. So I'm really into reading reviews, and always, all the way through my career as a journalist, one of the first things I would do if I was going to be doing a deep dive into something would be go and find some academic reviews and just really study them. They would be great for giving me background knowledge. It would be great for giving me people who I could approach, but also feature articles I'm a big fan of. I mean, the daily news studies, which we used to do many at the LA Times, were never my favorite, though I was quite proud of being able to do them in the time that I had. And I'd always try and talk to as many people as possible during the time that I had to get people's views of that paper and try and put in context. But I'm also into features where you delve a lot more deeply into a topic than a single study story would do. I'm not sure if I answered what you said.
I think you did. I think it's nice to get a peek under the hood, so to speak. So thanks very much for that. I think it's your turn to interview Diána now.
All right, Diána. Okay. So Diána, so what role do you think open access academic publishing can play in helping to forge solutions for climate change as compared to, gated articles?
Thank you, Rosie. That's a really excellent question, because climate change is, I think, the best example where without open access, we just cannot solve this problem. Why? The reason is because climate change is a global commons problem. We cannot solve climate change without a global agreement, without basically everyone being on board and everyone agreeing what we have to achieve globally. If just a few percent of those high emitters don't agree to the common solution, it won't work. But at the same time, our science is very much dominated by, especially climate change science, and here I'm not talking only about the physical science, but that related to mitigation, for example, is very much dominated by, and here I won't be very nice, but let's say German, I can say that because I'm German, white, male, the researchers, and white and Dutch, and those who actually have a good English, those who can easily publish and to have enough funding to publish, to pay for major big open access fees. The problem is that that this will dominate in the scientific debate, but we see increasingly that just the richest telling the world what we should be doing just won't work. We are just in a few days, we are going to have all our eyes on Glasgow and what will be achieved there. And we will see that it's not enough to have some of the richest countries be devoted and committed and knowing what we have to do to get there. But you really need to have the rest of the world on board. And we will never know that unless we have their voices equally in the science of both climate change and mitigation, and also the impact and adaptation. So it was very interesting that in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we had several times almost major failures because we thought we included sufficiently the knowledge and science of the developing world. But when we realized that no, it was just us in the global north thinking what they think and what we were trying to put into their mouths, it just wouldn't work until we really listened to them. So this is why I think it's incredibly important that climate change becomes a fully open access science, which means not only that everybody can see the papers and we're going to read the science that has access to the knowledge, but also that everybody can equally contribute to this knowledge and to this science. And so everyone has equal chance for publishing in a way that everybody can see their knowledge and their research.
So in other words, I mean, you've got an issue with people in many parts of the world whose libraries may not be able to afford a lot of the journals. So you've got access issues with the scientists who are doing research at those universities who they can't access the papers, the literature. But also, how do people publish their stuff if they can't open access, if they can't do the, what is it, the APC model? I'm sorry, I don't know about open access very much. I mean, do they just have to go, how does it work? What would work instead?
Well, that's exactly the problem there. Right now, it's very difficult for developing country scientists or in general, scientists from most countries from around the world, except for a handful, excuse me, except for a handful of richer countries to publish their research, because usually you either have to pay for getting published, or you have to pay for having your research open access. Now, the problem is that most people in most countries cannot afford this. So that means that the visible part of the knowledge is again with those who are anyway have more access to funding and research and are more, for them it's easier to publish. So the problem is that this divide between the global north and the global south and the knowledge contributed by these two universes is just getting bigger and bigger, and it's getting cemented. So it's extremely problematic. Also, yes, as you just said, it's a problem for accessing the knowledge as well, because I'm from Hungary, and which is not a developing country, and we cannot be considered as global south. But for example, we had over more than a year when the Hungarian National Academy of Sciences decided that we won't subscribe to one of the biggest scientific access providers. I won't say the name because they're charging more and more. But the charges were so incredibly high that at that time, it was 2 or 3 years ago, when actually many countries decided just not universally not pay for these. But that meant we were out there for a year without being able to access most of the knowledge out there. So it was very difficult to work. And I have to admit that I had to resort to some predatory methods to be able to do my science and contribute to the although IPCC often tries to help us. But when this wasn't available, it was very difficult to do our day-to-day jobs.
So another question I had, sort of shifting gears a little bit, would be sort of about the IPCC reports themselves, and sort of talking about access as meaning access of the lay public to these like very, very dense reports. Can you tell me a little bit about how the IPCC goes about trying to sort of broadcast this sort of the main points either to the general public or to policymakers? And do you think they do a good job?
That's a very good question, Rosie. Well, it's important to understand that the IPCC is an intergovernmental process, and its mandate is to advise policymakers and, most importantly, governments. So, and we operate on a very, very limited budget, and the budget is basically only for very specific purposes, for basically the governments to meet and also for the scientists to get together to write the reports. And even that is only for the developing countries of Global South scientists. So that means that we never had funding for communication, and also we never really thought that that's within our mandate, because our mandate was simply advise the government. Nevertheless, we did realize, I believe, after a couple of cycles that the way we are publishing is becoming very inaccessible, because the science is becoming more and more complex, more and more complicated. And it's very difficult even for our target audience to understand what we as scientists write down for them. So recently we have improved significantly. So we are hiring often communication consultants, and we are helping the researchers write at least the summary for policymakers in much more accessible languages. And we also have some limited efforts in when we release our reports to translate that to the media in fair and easy messages. Nevertheless, we do not take up the role of general communication of our products. What we do is we try to work with organizations whose mandate is science communication or climate change related communication, but we don't endorse those. So they come to us, we just give our products to them, and then they do this translation simply because we don't have capacity for that. But I think it's important so the question was really excellent, because it really has made a universe of difference since we do engage with communicators. Because for example, most people who are viewing this probably have heard about a report of global warming of 1.5 degrees, which had just a giant tsunami of media coverage after it was released almost exactly 3 years ago. And also a most recent report that we released in August, which was the physical science basis volume of the 6th assessment report, was very widely covered. And that is, I do believe, is the result of our increased efforts for communication. But certainly we can benefit from much more help in translating our indeed extremely complex and complicated messages and knowledge into more accessible languages.
Thank you. Lots more questions, but I guess we're out of time.
I think we're waiting for questions to come in. Is that right?
Well, I can ask Diana one more while we're waiting, if that would work. So my question might be, how well do you think that journalistic outlets do in transmitting information and the issues around climate change? Are there any things that drive you nuts that we do, or things you love that we do?
Well, in that case, let me use this opportunity as what the IPCC communication trainer advised me, that's an excellent question. So let me talk about this. So what I really want to answer to your question is that is what I really love is, for example, in annual reviews, what we are doing recently is not only open access publishing, but much more inclusive publishing. I think that's one level on beyond open access publishing, because it's not enough to make sure that the knowledge that we produce is available to everyone, and also to help those other researchers from other regions to publish their work. Excuse me. But it's also very important to encourage those communities who find it hard to publish to be more included in the science. So still, vast majority of the publications are authored by males. Also, mostly they are authored by Global North authors. Even within that, certain countries dominate. So I think journals such as Annual Reviews, which tries to make an effort to include on board on their papers as authors more women, also more authors from different regions of the world, really make whole science and research inclusive, and also knowledge more universal and more global. And that's, I think, essential for solving such complex and global problems such as climate change, but also to biodiversity and many other challenges where we just really need the whole globe to be on board. And also there's a lot of wisdom, indigenous wisdom, and other wisdom in other parts of the world, but that we really simply have lost already in the global north.
And in that regard, journalists should similarly try to work with more diverse sources as well, and not just, though it's tempting when you're on deadline, I've got to talk to somebody, I'll call such and such, cast a wider net.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you, yes. Now, if we are waiting, can I then ask one more question to Harmit, which I didn't get to ask, or... Because I think what's happening is that we may have lost Richard, so maybe we are waiting for Richard to return. So Harmit, do you think we need to translate our science? Do you think we need to package our work? And what are the pros and cons of packaging our science and our research results, our findings for the more general public?
Yeah, this is the sort of question I was asking Rosie as well, in the sense that, when we are typically talking to our peers, we are pretty careful and conservative in terms of our interpretations, because both parties know essentially the limits to what we were able to contribute. Even if it's a significant contribution, it's rarely the last word on the topic. As you know, like there's like more to do often, etc. That kind of nuanced view, where it's really more of a continuum rather than like, okay, this is pretty much the beginning and the end of the movie, which is sort of what a lay-friendly audience might expect, can lead to overinterpretations, which is something that we are already seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, where what are sort of gray zones of continuum in terms of vaccine mandates and public health crises are really seen as this very binary view, where you're in the wrong and I'm in the right, and vice versa. And that kind of thing is really hard to get away from in any kind of scientific context. So I sort of, I have my own doubts whether scientists can be called upon to do that relatively accurately themselves, about their own science, which is sort of why I asked Rosie whether we should be mandated to do our own lay-friendly summaries, or whether the model in which a third party sort of summarizes, checks in with the authors to make sure that nothing's being overinterpreted and summarizes might be a better model, because then in a way you're sort of not like, again, overinterpreting your own results in order to make it more palatable or perhaps more appealing to a really a fancy journal or a fancy newspaper like the New York Times or something, just because it's a much splashier headline. I think science that tends to be well done also tends to be conservative in terms of its interpretations, and also open about the caveats. Those are in long form articles, very easy to talk about. But when we're living in an age where, pretty much a Twitter headline with the number of characters that you're limited is all that you get, it can be very difficult. And there is a real possibility of somebody completely changing the actual conclusion of the paper just because that's the conclusion that they would prefer. And so I have my own doubts whether we want to necessarily change the sort of way we traditionally do things. But I do completely agree that there is a need to translate the findings to make it clear why this matters, why the public should pay attention to that. And, climate change and COVID-19 are the two topics that are absolutely at the forefront of everybody's mind in the world. So it's appropriate that we're discussing those two today. Richard is back.
Hi, yeah, hello.
Hi, Richard. Welcome.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's a major step forward. So I've missed a little bit here, but I wanted to ask a general question, just for my own interest. Science is in a very prominent position in all parts of the world now, in part due to for bad reasons. The climate change is very much preying on everyone's mind, and of course we're in the middle of a tremendous pandemic. What do you think are the lessons for scientists from this? How do you feel that scientists as individuals, and the science enterprise should engage with, for instance, policy making? How can we get the science quickly into the hands of policymakers and the public and the naysayers? How can we convince them of the credibility of science And what are the potential pitfalls of scientists becoming more media savvy and more involved in the discussion? Does it potentially undermine the way that science is viewed by society? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Diana, would you like to go first?
Thanks a lot. Yes, I would love to, because that's an excellent question. And I do believe that the IPCC is a fantastic model for this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was designed precisely for this, trying to synthesize the science, but co-produce this knowledge together with policymakers. So what we do is that we already, at the beginning of our reports, we sit together with the key policymakers and ask the questions together. And we give them the room that they can influence what we are going to be writing about. So we co-produce the outlines of the reports, and then the scientists fill up the content of the report. So the policymakers have no influence on that. But then the policymakers again have strong influence on the summary for policymakers. So what is for them, the policymakers? For them, what the messages are for them, which can only rely on a main report, so on the content that the scientists generated, but still this knowledge will be then co-produced. So in general, I think this is the IPCC model, which has been working very well, and it has been also copied in other fields, such as in biodiversity, and also it's being translated in many national equal similar models. We are also just starting the Hungarian IPCC process. But I think how it can be more generalized in a broader sense is, I think, the co-production of knowledge is really important. So involving more of the policymakers in the generation of the knowledge and in the generation of science as well. And not only scientists, but I think the practitioners as well. So the engineers, the architects, the plumbers, of course, they have no interest in publishing. But I have been, and also in the IPCC, we are putting more emphasis on that. And I have also managed to publish a paper in Annual Reviews, which was co-produced by the architecture community. And they are very interested in sharing their wisdom with the science. So I think we need more and more of this co-generation of the knowledge, because then they feel ownership of that, and it will be easier for them to access and to enact and implement that knowledge.
If I can just add a few things to what Diana said, I think the IPCC is a really excellent example how it can be done well. However, I think it is a very difficult knife's edge to tread, partly because, as scientists, we really want to operate under the guiding principle that we don't actually favor one model over the other before we do the experiment, right? So the best designed experiment is one that will falsify your favorite hypothesis. And if it becomes very clear that one scientist or one field of science is more associated with a certain point of view, with a certain sort of dominant sort of school of thought, that leads to the perception that there is a little bit of a ganging up, whereas in fact, in reality, every time you do an experiment, you're actually going in, trying very hard to make sure that the dominant hypothesis can be dismantled if you can find evidence to the contrary. Having said that, once it's very, very clear that there is actually very, very strong, overwhelming evidence to favor one point of view, it really behooves all scientists to really embrace that and really talk about it in a dispassionate way, to point out that this is actually the not just the scientific consensus, but this is the reason why we've arrived at this consensus. So it's a nice edge, because as soon as you espouse that point of view, you are seen by many as already sort of embracing the other side. And so you lose that objectivity that you worked so hard to kind of maintain in your work. But that's why I say it's a knife's edge, because at some point you do need to do that. I think the hesitancy that we are seeing with vaccine mandates, etc., is partly the result of a very small fraction of scientists who, in a frequency-dependent selection, because their perspective was contrary to the dominant majority and the scientifically held opinion, were elevated because media outlets really wanted the both sides of the argument. So even though this is a completely even not even a scientific viewpoint necessarily. This is actually elevated because these are the people who are really sort of really interested in writing New York Times bestsellers more than doing the original work that led to the model in the first place. And because of that, this creates this very weird dynamic in the media, which a lot of scientists don't want to engage with because that essentially is not what they got into the business for.
Yeah, I think this
Really
both sides thing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Rosie. Go ahead, Rosie.
I was going to say this both sides thing, you got to get both sides of the argument. It can be something that is overdone in journalism, especially when you've got, 99.99% of people who are pretty convinced it's one way and whatever the remainder is, who think the other way, and you're sort of giving both sides a platform. I also think a couple of other things when communicating with the public. I think it's important to sort of not be talk downy. I have people had people say to me, well, we need to give them a clear message, which means sometimes overstating the certainty of something, and that can come back to bite you later when things become less certain. And then also there have been times, and this is where I appreciate there is this sort of knife edge sort of situation where scientists campaigning for something can sort of look very self-interested, like around the time when they were, we have this proposition in California for a stem cell research center. There were a number of scientists going around whom I interviewed, sort of perhaps overplaying the state of stem cell research advances in animals and curing things like paralysis. And it made me feel, I don't know, it left a bit of a bad taste.
Let me ask a couple of quick questions because we don't have much time. And this is really for you, Rosie, and Diána. How do we incorporate other forms of knowledge into the debate as well? One of the questions is about indigenous or local knowledge, which may be very helpful in combating climate change at a local or maybe even at a global level. Are there ways that scientists and science reports can and do incorporate indigenous knowledge into their reporting, and are there ways that journalists are starting to do that as well, and should they?
Absolutely, Richard, that's spot on. That's a very important issue, because for a long time we were just thinking that it's us, we know what the world is like, and they are just undeveloped, but now we realize that actually no, we really need their knowledge. We actually rely very much, we depend on their wisdom, because there is just no way to solve, for example, certain adaptation challenges without the wisdom that's accumulated in indigenous communities for centuries, if not through millennia. So, for example, and I apologize that I always bring in the IPCC, but that's where I spend most of my time. For example, our last report that we released in August was actually released on Indigenous Knowledge Day, and the chair opened the whole event with our emphasis on integrating Indigenous knowledge. So yes, we do try, but I think, Richard, it's still a very good question, because it's not easy. Indigenous knowledge doesn't work with the methods that are scientific excellence measures. It works with totally different, it's on a different platform. It's very difficult in our very rigid schemes and scientific establishment structures to integrate that. So I think the methods and how we best do that are really still out there, how to better, and perhaps Rosie can help with what other things we can do to bring it on board. But I think it's crucially important that we do more to work with them, and not, this has to be a collaboration. This has to be binary and with respect, and not only us telling them.
Well, I know we're just about out of time, but so I just say very quickly that I think journalists are more and more, and as is quite right and proper, thinking a lot harder about trying to seek out diverse voices. and sources to interview. And I think just in general, a really good exercise when you're a journalist and you're trying to figure out who to talk with is to sort of imagine to yourself who all the stakeholders are, and make sure that you don't just, if you're writing something about psychology, interview more and more and more and more psychologists, but think about all the other people who have a point of view, who have knowledge, who you should reach out to as well.
Great. And I've got like another 6 questions here, but unfortunately we're out of time. Maybe we can get together again. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Harmit. Thank you, Diána, for really informative conversations. Thanks for everyone that participated in the chat and asked questions. And thanks very much to everyone for joining the event. The next online event, please mark your calendars, takes place on Wednesday, November 17, and is titled The Science of Viral Variants from COVID to the Flu. Participants include Edward Holmes from the University of Sydney in Australia and Lisa Gralinski from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the United States. Amongst other things, they'll discuss the genetics that generate variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus associated with new waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. So thanks again. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks very much to our 3 panelists today. See you soon. Bye.